Now going to start our session of panels. And our first panel is going to be led by Amir Khalilia, and I'm going to introduce these guys in a second. He is the most connected man in life sciences. He sits on boards, he advises companies, he's kind of absolutely everywhere. Sort of like Where's Waldo or maybe Forrest Gump. You look around, there's Forrest Gump is in every single important situation. I saw one of his tweets, this was hysterical, I think 2 weeks ago, you'll know what I'm talking about in a second, when he took a photograph of Eric Topol's brand new book, Deep Medicine. I don't know if you guys are familiar with his new book, Deep Medicine, and he said, I got my hands on a copy of the book, and it hadn't been released yet. And Eric said, where did you get that? Because the publisher has been tight-fisted and no one has that book. He's like, I have my ways, he writes. So he even gets people's books before they can get their books. So that's Amir, and the rest other folks are all here, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But we're going to now turn our attention to regulators. And thinking about, here we've had a whole morning and a whole part of the afternoon talking about these incredible therapeutics and the whole notion of digiceuticals. We know pharmaceuticals are heavily regulated, and digiceuticals are also subject to regulation if we make claims on them and if we plan to use them with patients backed by claims. So we'll hear more about what does that mean and what are the sort of pros and cons of regulatory pathways. And so we've got 4 terrific speakers that will provide different perspectives about working with regulators. So come on up, guys, and I'm going to let Amir take it from here and introduce our panelists. Thank you guys for being here.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that. Thanks for everyone coming in from the break. I wasn't worried. I was worried which tweet he was going to refer to. I wasn't quite sure. It was the Arctic Circle, was it Australia? But you went back to the AI. Yeah, Eric definitely wants to know. It was kind of funny. I am his neighbor, though, so he could have just come around the corner. So today, I'm just wondering, we just finished talking about Disney, which is all about experience, right? And how many of you, I'm just wondering, we're going to talk about some 3-lettered acronymed agency. How many people here have had to personally deal with the FBI? Anyone? Okay. CIA? The NSA? I see one person, a couple of people admitting that they have dealings with the NSA. This is quite good. So although the FDA has been quite scary for some people, actually, when I think about all the possible agencies we could be dealing with in the government, the FDA is probably one of the better ones to be dealing with. And the first point I want to make, I don't think we have anyone from the FDA here. I want to say nice things about them behind their backs. So the FDA for years, industry, and I'm in the life science industry, and we spent years, people used to complain, oh, it's the FDA. We like to innovate, it's the FDA. Whereas the truth really was it wasn't the FDA necessarily getting in their way. It was the conservatism of the industry itself, right? So that was the old days, I think, since probably even before Scott took over as commissioner. And I think most people would agree Scott's probably done the best job of any commissioner in recent memory. And Bakul, who's been head of digital, they've really done an amazing job at really interacting with people, whether it's pharma, whether it's digital, whether it's startups, in my opinion. So I'm actually want to start by being very positive about the fact that in my experience now, I've had 20 years of dealing with the FDA on the pharma side, which has probably been more challenging. And I had no white hairs before I started doing that. So I like to hear from the startups, what their experience has been, why even go down the FDA route? Is that something we need to do? And hopefully we'll hear from them. So I'll do most of the listening from now on, so I just want to put that context in. So Jennifer, maybe we start with you. Would you like to tell us who you are, what your company does to start with?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. My name is Jennifer Silva. I'm a practicing pediatric cardiologist at Washington University in St. Louis. I additionally am the co-inventor and co-founder of Sentiar. Sentiar is a spin-out out of Washington University, and we're using augmented reality to help guide and assist minimally invasive cardiac ablation procedures. So the procedures that I do every day, we've developed a technology to help assist with them. And I'm here on this panel probably because I speak to the FDA pretty regularly about
Great,
this.
so we'll come back to that.
Yep.
So Gigi, you're next.
Hello, hi, I'm with MindMaze. We have a range of neuro rehab products, which have been neurotherapy. I was on Wall Street until a few years ago, but got involved with MindMaze initially with finance and strategy, and more recently in corporate development and business strategy. I have not direct experience with FDA, but I have secondhand information and a lot of problems we deal with, or not problems, solutions we deal with FDA, and it has been a good experience so far.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Iran. I'm not a clinician, and the reason why I'm sitting here is that 4 years ago, I was diagnosed as suffering from whiplash due to the active flight. I'm a former F-16 pilot in the Israeli Air Force. And during my own rehab, the idea came about to combine VR and rehab. And today, the company is developing a broad solutions in VR. We are a medical device company. We have 4 applications registered on the FDA record, FDA Class 2, and we are about to register 2 more. We have more than 35,000 VR treatments to date, 14 clinical trials in parallel. And we believe, like I think all the people in the room, that VR is the future for healthcare.
Hi, I'm Joe Powers, Chief Strategy Officer with Applied VR. Applied VR is the leader in digital therapeutics and VR therapeutics. We have products in over 250 hospitals across the nation in about 8 countries. Several tens of thousands of patients that have used our products. And I'm specifically here and looking forward to sharing a number of conversations that we've been having with the regulators over the past several months on really introducing VR and the differentiation of VR from what we call first generation digital therapeutics and what we now call DTX 2.0.
I look forward to hearing that. So Jennifer, let's start with you, maybe if you get the mic. Tell us what your experience has been dealing as a startup with FDA. What's that been about?
So my background as a clinician put me in the position to be very defensive going into the FDA, right? So I think it's...
And what do you mean by that, defensive?
So I went in armed with the idea that they were going to obstruct what I wanted to do. Okay. That we had a technology that we thought was novel and innovative, and that it was going to be somewhat an adversarial conversation. And so our first interaction, we actually went to them. We did an in-person meeting, and I suggest for those of you that are starting in this process, having a first meeting in person helps. It's really hard to say no to somebody's face. It's really easy to do it by phone.
That's good advice.
Yeah, and we went and we brought everything we could bring. We brought headsets, we brought demos, and we put it on their heads, so that they started getting a sense of what it was that we were trying to do. And then the approach that we've taken, and I'm very curious to what you guys do, is that we just started talking to them frequently and often. So we're very fortunate. We also have NIH funding, and so the NIH helps to facilitate these ongoing conversations with the FDA. So some I do under the guise of being a pure CENTIAR conversation. Some are sort of couched within the NIH. NIH has these grants for small businesses, the SBIR and STTR programs. Some of them are couched within that. So they're not necessarily directly related, because we all know you have to be very careful what you say in front of the FDA.
I'm just curious, did you have a regulatory consultant, or did you just rush in there with your first meeting?
Yeah, no, we had a regulatory consultant, yes.
The reason I asked that is a lot of them would tell you to be very careful to even have a meeting with the
Yes.
FDA. Okay.
So we talked about this with our regulatory consultant, and she was positioned next to me, and under the table would just sort of, tap me under the table if she thought I was maybe going a little too far. And I think it was important to have her, right? So there were lessons learned from those first interactions that were critically important, but there was nothing like that first meeting. Because we went to that first meeting, and every time I saw them afterwards, they're like, oh yeah, ablation hologram girl. I was like, yeah, okay, now I have a title. And every meeting since, my branch chief, or not my branch chief, but the FDA's branch chief, that's what he says. Hologram girl, cardiac hologram girl. Tell me about progress on this. Tell me about progress on that.
So how did you find them? You explained going there and putting headsets on their heads, but how was their sort of openness to you?
They were super helpful. They were fascinating. They were fascinated by the technology. They hadn't experienced it before. And it's been very interesting, because I feel like they're looking to us to help them figure out how to regulate this intra-procedural space in general, right? So I'm not going to claim to know anything about therapeutics or anything like that. We have a very clear-cut indication, which is intraprocedural use. And so what they've come to us and said is, let's understand what the technology limitations are, what we need to have as clinicians that are going to provide a tool that's safe for patients and going to improve outcomes.
So you're learning together, really.
We are learning together.
Great. So Gigi, you explained that you didn't necessarily have the MindMaze contact with FDA before you came, but can you tell us a little bit about the company's experience with FDA?
I mean, our experience have been very positive overall.
And can you keep the microphone close to you?
Our experience have been very positive so far. Every time we have tried to always have the first meetings like you suggested, and they are very helpful. And it is, I think, something which should go in the legends. That you would always say that urban legend that FDA is bad or it's not helpful, but it's actually not true. They're extremely proactive, always very helpful, and they're actually looking, I mean, from their point of view, they're looking at the end user and how we are trying to help them. And we are doing something which is going to help the industry overall, help us, everyone in this country. So they are extremely helpful in trying to see what needs to be done. And they can also help us in guiding exactly what pathways would or would not work, depending on the kind of claims you want to do. Is this what we're thinking of would work or not? And they can suggest alternative pathways which may be equally effective. So it should be like we always go to FDA with an open mind and discuss exactly what we're trying to do and how to do it best.
So can you remind us for MindMaze what FDA interaction you've had, or what approvals or anything like that you've had from them?
So we have two neuro rehab products which are being approved by FDA through the 510(k) process. The Pro and the MindMotion Go. The Pro is for inpatient use. It's the first device which has been approved for inpatient rehab. And MindMotion Go is more targeted towards clinical and home use.
Thank you. So Aaron, I guess I didn't know you were an F-16 pilot, so not much must scare you going into a meeting with someone.
Startup life is much more chaotic than to fly an F-16, by far.
So tell us about your companies and the FDA interactions. And
So I want to echo what my fellows on the panel said. From our perspective, the FDA is not the barrier. And they are very cooperative. They want to help. They want to bring more new technology to the table, whether you're doing a personal meeting or submitting a 513G to help you determine the type of the product. I think that the troubles or the challenges starts by operating as a medical device company. That's a decision that any company needs to make before they are launching a product. And basically that starts with what is your claim? What's the intended use? After that, you probably need to pay $700 per hour for a consultant to tell you, according to that claim, where are you falling into the regulatory field. And then, basically, you need to continue the process. But the ongoing process of a medical device company, I think that's the biggest challenge, right? It's all the documentation, quality assurance, liability, and it's basically the day-to-day activity completely change once you are a medical device company. I can tell you that I believe that for us as an industry, and basically this room is the VR industry at the moment, if we want to make the VR a medical device to be used by clinicians in a broad way, there is no other way besides operating as a medical device company, conduct clinical trial, try to prove to the community that this technology is a game changer.
So why did you say there's no other way? Tell me about that.
Because I think that you need to decide what is your claim. If the claim is, I want to improve patient experience, that's good. I'm not saying it's bad, and you can, by the way, make a lot of money by doing that. But if you want to say that you are curing, treating, measuring, things with medical claims, you need to play by the rules. And there are very simple rules. It's not a gray area. If you want to use VR as a technology and do those kinds of elements, you need to operate as a medical device company. And we are now, as an industry, we are setting the foundation for the next 20 years. And if we'll operate the right way, we'll be able to convince the world that this is a game changer. And if we'll decide to use VR as an entertainment tool, I think that we won't be able to to harness the amazing possibilities that this technology can bring to the table.
Thank you. That's great. So, Joe, moving on to you for now. You've had really extensive experience across multiple entities dealing with regulators. So, what would you like to sort of tell people today?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, as everyone shared, the experience has been very positive. I remember, harking back to the days in pharma, I mean, probably next to spiders, there was nothing scarier than the FDA for me. I mean, I feel like the clouds would come over the pharma building and you knew that was a day you were talking to the regulators. And I remember in the context of digital therapeutics, only a few years ago, with dread and having our CEO read the email that I was typing to some nondescript FDA account, and we had to prep, and do we really need the board, and how do we evaluate it? Only to get like this one-liner back, you want a meeting? And it was a phone call with Bakul, and he said, hey, Joe, what's going on? And it started an incredible relationship. And we've had, as Jennifer mentioned, very collaborative engagement. In fact, Amir, I know you run a wonderful conference, CNS Summit. At the last conference, I spent about 2 hours with Bakul, and we were talking about some of our regulatory strategy, but more so to hear the agencies say, so what's your business model? How are you going to market? How are you going to get people to pay? I mean, and genuinely want to know, to put on the VR goggles, to sort of be fascinated by the potential for VR was just, an amazing experience. What we've been discussing with the FDA lately, and this, was really inspired by conversations with Bakul, is to separate what we call, again, DTX 2.0, what we believe is really the next generation of digital therapeutics, largely VR, from sort of the earlier first generation of digital therapeutics. And by this, I mean that I've been involved in the digital health space for about 2 decades now. I was introduced to applied VR and had a similar experience as Dr. Spiegel mentioned earlier in the conversation. It was a wow like I had never experienced before. And immediately it clicked, and to Aaron's point, we have the ability with virtual reality to really make a profound impact in crisis settings, in acute settings where people are having panic attacks, where people are in extreme pain, in ways that apps simply can't. And I would take a slightly different approach to what you were mentioning, although I completely agree. I feel that virtual reality companies and therapeutic VR companies, and certainly this is the perspective that Applied VR is taking, who really have the potential to stretch the boundaries of digital therapeutics and make a significant therapeutic effect in extreme situations as we're pursuing. It's not that we do this because we want the FDA to regulate us so that we're taken seriously, which is really what many of the sort of DTX 1.0 companies were strategizing and doing. We're regulated because of the significance and the impact and the risks that we provide. It truly is an incredible tool that's being used, as we saw with many of the presentations today. And I really see us as an industry coming together, showing the FDA that this is a serious medical device. And then just to finalize, so in light of that, Bakul really inspired us to create a VR medical consortium and encouraged us to reach out to Scott Gottlieb. Unfortunately, he's no longer with the FDA. We did send him a note. We spoke with Jeff Shuren and others. And other companies, such as VR Health, bringing them together with the FDA, with CMS, with others, and we hope that everyone here will join us in this VR medical consortium, which we can talk more about, to introduce to the medical community and the government and other stakeholders that VR truly is not your mother's digital therapeutic. It's DTX 2.0.
So can you say, look, that's a very intriguing idea. So you've done a great job articulating sort of the difference. Is there anything else that would differentiate a DTX2 from a DTX1?
Yeah, I mean, I can use a story, and I've shared this with you before. We have one of our partners, Innova Health System in Virginia, great partner, and they had an incident maybe 6 or so months ago. So they use our product. They have it in the ER. They don't exactly know how they're going to use it, usually in crisis situations. They had a boy, I believe he was somewhere around 6 or 7 years old. He came into the ER screaming bloody murder. I mean, just screaming. He had a 3-inch splinter under his big toe. And that's the response I expect. Anyone who doesn't respond that way, there's something definitely wrong. It says 3, and you can imagine. And so they called anesthesia. They're rolling him into the OR. They're going to remove the splinter. And the nurse who's rolling him into the ER sees the VR device on the shelf, grabs it, puts it on his head, and immediately he stops, starts paying attention, engaged in the game. Nurse comes over, pulls out the splinter, right? Show me an app that can do that, right? And so, prevented the anesthesia, harm to the child left much faster. That's just one of hundreds of use cases that we get. You'll hear some other folks talk about applied VR and other VR solutions. That's what I mean about the next generation of digital therapeutic.
That's great. By the way, I know many people are sad that Scott's left, but I think the acting commissioner will be great. And I think Amy, who's from Flatiron, who's going to be the principal deputy, I think she's fantastic. So I'm very hopeful. I think the FDA is probably the most functional government department that I know of at the moment. So, so I think we're pretty lucky with that in many ways. So Jennifer, let's come back to you. What advice might you have for other startups apart from meet in person for the first time? Anything else that you would recommend for people as they think about interacting with the regulators?
I think that having informal conversations, as you mentioned, are super helpful. They can be a little confusing, right? So when if I'm at a meeting and my lead reviewer happens to walk by, I'm assured a 2-hour conversation where he will talk himself in a complete circle. And afterwards, I'm just like, okay, so what do I need to do here? Like, what are my action items? So those informal conversations are good, but understanding what the clear action items are, understanding that the FDA is completely entitled to change their mind whenever they want, and knowing that they're not always working on a timescale that you as a startup are working on, right? So startups are at breakneck pace. That's part of being a startup. And the FDA will say, we have 75 days to get back to you, and they will get back to you on day 74. They are completely within their right, and it's within their time frame to do so, but it can be disruptive if you're expecting them to move faster.
Well, you're not their only submission, right?
I'm not their only submission. I'd like to think I'm their only submission that matters, but I'm not their only submission. One thing that we found is that we just tell them in advance, expect you are going to be getting paperwork from us here, and they know then to help move it along, and then leveraging any other contacts that you might have. So we've used the NIH to great effect with the FDA to help them not just put it in a pile, but to maybe move it up.
That's great. Do you have any thoughts from a company perspective?
I mean, the only something which is very important from a startup point of view is putting in the right QA process, and that is extremely important for FDA. We have to follow the 21 CFR. We should put in the processes in place. We have to have right documentation. If something is not documented, it's almost like it does not exist. You need to be very particular with minute details with submissions, making sure file names are correct, making sure that all the page numbers are correctly identified, because any single delay can actually add 2 weeks, for example, in FDA not accepting the submission simply because you have a minor error, like a file name was not named correctly. So it's important to have all of these processes in place, and as Mindmaze, at least our experience has been, you should not shy off from hiring consultants. They're extremely helpful in getting through the process and making sure that everything you're doing is done by the book and as expected.
Great. Aaron, do you have any thoughts?
So I think that was the exact describe of the challenges. Again, the FDA it's not the first step. You need to decide that you want to be a medical device company. decide what your claim, operate like a medical device company needs to operate, and then the FDA is basically, as long as you have open discussions, there is no surprises there. I think the nice thing that we found out, again, is the same thing that my colleagues is describing here. Open communication. They are willing to help, willing to help you guide your way in that complexity of the regulation. I think that, and circling back to what Joe said, our challenge, by the way, as a VR industry is that I'm not sure that we know today if it's the VR that makes all the effect as a technology in different kind of use case, or is a specific app that is making all the benefits, or we can claim something for a specific app. I'm assuming, by the way, it's different between different verticals, different kind of use cases. But I think, again, us as a early industry, we need to try to understand better whether VR as a technology has benefits, that is regardless of what we're doing, just the fact that the technology is so immersive, and what's the added value that we can bring as developers, as companies, that we can claim on top of the VR as an industry.
Sounds like an analogy to me is when if you do any TM training, they spend an hour showing you a video saying that only TM is the only meditation that can work, not other generic meditation. So that's the analogy I can think of, which I thought was kind of funny when I did that training. Joe, do you have any thoughts for startups that from your experience?
I will say, though, I think Applied VR would probably argue that our apps are better than many others. And I say that because we've invested millions of dollars in clinically validating not just our app, but comparing them to sham VR and other types of VR apps. And I think it goes to the point that my earlier point with FDA, it's the rigorous testing. It's that while FDA, we basically had an infomercial for FDA engagement at this point here, but it's not easy, and it's really expensive, and you've got to do it right. As you were mentioning, small, words that are left out or things of that in the application can set you back months or longer, or lead to outcomes that you don't desire. So I think that it's not just we have to pursue or should consider pursuing the limits of VR in terms of FDA, but also in terms of clinical efficacy, investing in understanding how your apps work, understanding what it is within the apps that work. I think there's certainly an effect of VR in general, but there's definitely a different effect, a much greater effect if you can demonstrate sort of the mechanism of action of aspects within the VR experience. And I want to sort of encourage everyone to continue the research in that area.
So that's a really interesting point. I think Adam this morning gave some examples of some of the sort of neuroscience-based work that they've done, and really thinking about the development of the app and having real. I can think of various domains that are important. Can you just clarify why you think like a particular company's app may be superior? What components of that experience in your mind are?
I mean, we have a whole R&D team, both clinical R&D, but also just in the science of sort of app development, the science of gaming, the science of how content is communicated effectively. So everything from using different color palettes to sounds to really leveraging the full experience. Is there sort of a steady cognitive load? Are there peaks? And there have been a number of studies looking at VR versus, let's say, Nintendo games. Or we've had some folks at a university on the West Coast, may or may not start with an S and a T, that developed an app sort of as they saw our product as sort of to compete with our product and demonstrate clinical efficacy, and they didn't have it. And I think that was really a learning for us. It actually allowed us to really put our foot on the pedal in terms of amping up the science of every single scene within the experience, tailoring how the progression of the apps, right? Understanding how people learn, understanding how people engage with apps, and more so how different profiles of people engage with different types of app. And we certainly saw some of that work here at Cedars-Sinai when we introduced a select number of apps versus a larger number of experiences, much greater effect. So I think there's a lot of science that we can bring, and I encourage everyone as they're considering FDA and the overall even commercial strategy to really max out on pushing the limits and clinical efficacy of VR as well.
So I just wanted to piggyback on that. So one of the things that the FDA is going to push very hard on for any of us who go talk to them is human factors engineering, right? And so this is a specific domain that relates to VR and AR that they are going to want boatloads of data on. And they not only want it up front, they're going to want more as we keep getting more complex applications, and particularly as the risk levels increase with what we're doing. And so if you're not familiar with human factors engineering, and I'm the first person to admit, I didn't even know such a field existed when I started. I got to know some really well, really fast, and spent a lot of time with them. And it turned out that what I was learning from them was critically important, and quite frankly, some of the most important data that FDA wanted. They know the clinical data is going to come, but they're not going to be willing to clear or release for use until they understand what that human factors engineering has showed.
That's a really good point, because if you think about the first digital medicine approval, Proteus or Otsuka, it was the human factors that actually put them back. They had to resubmit. So it is something FDA takes very seriously. They're
Yeah,
going to be patiently waiting.
Yeah, so I'm just want to circle back.
Yep.
I wouldn't sit here if I wouldn't think that specific app, VR app, have benefits on, comparing to other apps. But having said that, and it's a big but, before we are going and telling to the medical community that our app specifically have benefits on comparing to the VR, we need to go to the FDA, we need to probably do a full 510K, show them all the results, and let them prove us that we can say that. Because in any other way, anyone can say that their specific VR app is better than others. That's why I'm saying that there is no other way in the medical community to have a walk around. If you decide that this is your claim, you need to do the entire route. You need to show them for a third-party, objective, FDA regulatory authority that will back your claim. And again, we haven't concluded all the clinical trials. I am very optimistic, but I can't say for sure that our app is better than a meditation app, for that matter, that we can download from the Oculus Store. But again, the fact that we are spending money and resources on it, because I believe that's the case. But only after you complete the process and have the FDA stamp, then you can go and say, okay, this is the differentiator that I have.
So we're almost out of time. I want to finish one thing which I didn't warn you anything about. So I'm very conscious we have a live stream. We have people who've flown here from as far away as Australia. Not quite the same flight as me. They wanted a couple of days to recover from the jet lag. I'm too stupid to have flown straight in. So we've talked about the FDA, but there are other regulators in the world and other countries in the world. What are your thoughts, if any, about what companies are doing to really talk to EMA, the Chinese authorities, the Japanese, as a whole? My world has been that for 20 years, so I'm just wondering whether you've thought about that, what you think about global approvals.
So we just received the CE mark approval. By the way, we had the same experience like we had with the FDA. I think that agencies around the world are taking the same approach of being more open-minded and help companies to bring products to the market that can reduce costs, can improve access. The only problem is that it's a different process. So it's different documentation, different legal process, so it costs more money, and you need to decide whether you are willing to spend that resources and not just spend in one market.
Any other comments before we finish?
I guess the one thing I would say is that the FDA has gone through significant efforts to move first-in-man studies back to the US. It was very common years ago for those to be done outside of the US. And so that was a very conscious decision on their part. And very early on, they said with us, please do your first-in-human studies, not just in adults, but in children, and please do them in the US. So they were very clear about that up front, and I think that that's been music to my ears, certainly.
So the last thing I'll say about that is I think in terms of, I'll let you finish as well, Joe, is in terms of global populations, I do believe that we do need to test things in a population that represents the, the consumer base at the end of it. Go ahead, Joe, you can have the last
I
one.
just wanted to say again, I mentioned our VR Medical Consortium, and we feel really strongly, and I want to, echo your sentiment of sort of the VR community sort of coming together. I really encourage any company that's looking to pursue FDA, that's looking to build studies in therapeutic VR. I can speak for me, I think I can speak for you as well, to really reach out. We want to build a community of like-minded companies, whether it's FDA, whether it's clinical trials, whether it's US and abroad. And if we haven't contacted you, please connect with anyone at Applied VR, and we can share with you more our thoughts around this VR Medical Consortium.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Please join me in thanking my panel for what I think was a very interesting panel.